The morning is colorless. Ash-gray smoke drifts between the trees, clinging to wet branches and broken trunks. Somewhere beyond the mist, artillery has fallen silent. Only the wind moves now, whispering through 1,000 ruined pines. In a half-collapsed bunker, a German sniper steadies his rifle against a shattered log. His breath fogs the scope. He has been waiting for hours, motionless, patient, confident. The Americans always come the same way. Loud boots, careless movement, silhouettes easy to pick off through the fog. But today feels different. The forest seems to breathe. A dense, muffled silence, too still for comfort. Then, shapes begin to form within the smoke. Not running, not shouting, just walking. Slow, steady figures moving through the gray haze as if untouched by fear or sound. The sniper blinks, adjusts his scope. They keep coming, their outlines fading in and out like ghosts. He tightens his finger on the trigger and hesitates, because for the first time, he can't tell if the men in the smoke are real or already dead. The mist hangs, the tension heavy. Behind this eerie moment lies a long and brutal campaign that brought both armies to this cursed forest. By the autumn of 1944, the Second World War in Europe had entered a relentless and exhausting phase. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded. France was liberated. But as the front pushed eastward, the war that many thought would end by Christmas had instead become darker, slower, and more merciless. The Western Allies now faced the heart of Germany, and the heart was fighting back. Beyond the Belgian border stretched the Hurtgen Forest, a dense tangle of firs and ravines spreading over 50 square miles. It looked tranquil on a map, but for soldiers, it was hell disguised as woodland. Narrow trails, steep ridges, and deep mud made movement nearly impossible. Even tanks and trucks became trapped in the tangled roots and slick slopes. To the Allied command, this region stood as a final barrier before the Rhine River, the symbolic gateway to Germany's industrial core. To the Germans, it was sacred ground, the outer shield of the Siegfried Line, their last defensive wall. The first American units entered the forest in September 1944. What they expected was a limited operation to secure the flank for a larger advance north. What they found was a fortress made of trees. Every ridge concealed an MG-42 nest. Every trench was wired, mined, and pre-registered for artillery fire. The Germans had no intention of retreating. Orders from Hitler himself demanded that the West Wall be held at any cost. And so, while the Wehrmacht crumbled elsewhere, the units defending the Hurtgen were commanded to stand, bleed, and stall the Americans for as long as possible. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, directed multiple divisions into the region, the 9th, 28th, 8th, and later the 4th Infantry Divisions, all veterans of Normandy and the Siegfried Line. But none were prepared for what awaited inside that forest. The weather turned bitter. Rains filled foxholes, ammunition rusted, and visibility dropped to meters at best. Radios failed under the canopy. The air was heavy with the smell of pine and cordite. The forest muffled sound. An artillery shell could land a few hundred meters away, and men would only feel the tremor beneath their boots. Every hill became a graveyard. Snipers and machine gunners ruled the shadows. The Germans, often from the 89th and 275th Infantry Divisions, were masters of camouflage, hidden in pillboxes or dugouts carved directly into the hillsides. They used the forest itself as a weapon, cutting tree trunks to fall under artillery impact, turning splinters into deadly shrapnel. Day after day, American platoons advanced a few hundred yards, only to be pinned down, cut apart, and forced to start again. They named parts of the forest themselves: Suicide Hill, Death Factory, Bloody Ridge. Still, the orders came. Advance. General Hodges wanted the Ruhr River dams, fearing the Germans might release floodwaters that could stall Allied armor further east. To get to those dams, the forest had to be cleared. So, the fight continued. Men slipped through fog and rain, clutching rifles that jammed with mud. Corpsmen crawled through shell holes under sniper fire, dragging the wounded out by their belts. The wounded froze before evacuation could reach them. By late October, the 28th Infantry Division, known as the Keystone Division, had been sent in to replace exhausted units. They entered the forest, believing they could finish what others had started. Within days, they realized the forest would not let them go so easily. As November approached, the Hurtgen became a gray world of smoke, shattered trees, and unburied dead. The Germans believed they had the upper hand. They knew the terrain, controlled the ridges, and waited behind scopes and crosshairs. But something was shifting. The Americans were learning. They began coordinating artillery barrages with smoke screens, masking movements, confusing German sight lines, and advancing under a curtain of gray that neutralized the enemy's deadliest advantage: vision. Soon, that mist would blur the line between hunter and hunted. The forest was about to become a stage where patience, fear, and discipline collided, and where German snipers, once confident in their dominance, would soon face an enemy that no longer played by the same rules. By early November 1944, the Hurtgen Forest had consumed men and divisions alike. Its twisted network of ravines and ridgelines turned maps useless. Compass bearings vanished under the canopy. Soldiers joked bitterly that the forest itself was the enemy. And, in a way, it was. The German defenders thrived in this chaos. For them, this was defensive warfare perfected. Each platoon of the Wehrmacht and Fallschirmjäger, paratroopers redeployed as elite infantry, treated every bunker and trench as their own world. Snipers, in particular, became the silent masters of this world. Armed with Karabiner 98K rifles, some fitted with the legendary ZF-42 scopes, they waited for days in camouflaged pits, tree stands, or ruined bunkers. They fired not for volume, but for precision. One shot, then silence. Another hour of waiting. Their confidence came not from numbers, but from invisibility. To the German command, snipers were instruments of fear. Their purpose was not only to kill, but to paralyze. A single bullet could freeze an entire American company for hours. The forest amplified that terror. One moment of motion, and the next, a comrade would drop, lifeless and unseen. But across the lines, the U.S. infantry was transforming. The men who entered the Hurtgen in September had been veterans of Normandy's hedgerows and France's villages, yet nothing had prepared them for this. Not the cold, not the silence, not the constant feeling that death lived among the trees. Under this pressure, adaptation became instinct. Platoons began to move differently. They no longer relied on open trails or predictable routes. They learned to fan out, to crawl, to use smoke and shadow as weapons. When artillery units fired, they followed the thunder, slipping forward through the haze that lingered after impact. Among the most significant tactical adjustments was the use of smoke shells. Originally intended to mark targets for artillery or air support, smoke became a shield. It turned the battlefield into an uncertain void where even snipers struggled to aim. The Americans realized that when the fog was thickest, they could move unseen. The German snipers, who once viewed the battlefield through clarity and control, began to lose their edge. Their optics fogged, their targets dissolved. The sound of boots on leaves grew closer, but the forest revealed nothing. To many, it felt like the Americans were turning into something unearthly. They appeared suddenly in the mist, faces blackened, helmets glistening with rain, rifles raised in silence. Then they vanished again. Inside the German bunkers, doubt began to creep in. Reports from the 275th Infantry Division mentioned smoke movements, soldiers advancing under thick artillery haze then striking from multiple angles at once. German officers urged their men to hold fire until visibility cleared, but by then, the Americans were already inside the wire. Meanwhile, in the rear lines, German command faced an impossible truth. Reinforcements were thin, supplies were scarce. Most divisions were fighting at half strength, their best soldiers long gone. Yet Hitler's orders left no room for retreat. "Hold the West Wall," the Führer demanded, "or there will be no Germany left to defend." So they stayed. In contrast, the American divisions rotated fresh troops whenever possible, though replacements were often inexperienced. Some were barely 20 years old, carrying rifles heavier than their confidence. Yet, in the crucible of Hürtgen, they learned quickly, or died quickly. Veterans took the lead, showing new arrivals how to move silently, how to sense danger by the shift in wind or the echo of a distant branch snapping. By mid-November, fog and smoke became permanent residents of the battlefield. The artillery never ceased. Trees shattered from above, their splinters killing as efficiently as shrapnel. Beneath it all, the psychological strain deepened. Men began to talk less, sleep less, and stare into nothing for hours. Still, the orders came. Advance, clear, hold. In one of the forest's many ravines, a company of the U.S. 8th Infantry Division prepared for yet another push through the mist. They knew snipers were ahead. They also knew the forest would not allow them to see those rifles until it was too late. So they created their own invisibility, calling in a rolling smoke barrage before stepping into the gray, unknown. It was this moment, this quiet shift in tactics, born of exhaustion and necessity, that would soon reverse the balance of fear in the Hürtgen forest. For the first time, the hunters would lose their sight, and the ghosts would walk. From here, the scene narrows to those inside the forest, the men, their weapons, their instincts, and the invisible duel between patience and terror. For the German sniper, the forest was not chaos, it was order. Every broken stump, every fallen branch, every patch of shadow held meaning. In that quiet geometry of death, he ruled unseen. The Karabiner 98K, chambered in 7.92 mm, was his instrument of control. The rifle was reliable, precise, and fitted with telescopic sights that magnified the world of his enemy. From his vantage, he watched men live and die as distant silhouettes, unaware that they were being studied, measured, and erased with a single breath. Training for these sharpshooters began long before the Hürtgen campaign. Germany's sniper schools emphasized patience, concealment, and the psychology of fear. A sniper's mission was not simply to eliminate, it was to dominate the enemy's emotions. A single kill could halt an entire platoon, forcing soldiers to cower under cover, doubting every movement, every shadow. In the early weeks of fighting, the Germans executed this craft flawlessly. Snipers positioned along ridgelines and in camouflaged foxholes turned each American advance into a bloody crawl. Their discipline was absolute. They waited until the perfect shot. No movement, no waste, but the Hürtgen forest was not a traditional battlefield. The endless fog, rain, and shattered canopy limited even a sniper's vision. The dampness warped wood stocks and fogged lenses. Tree bursts from artillery scattered debris across their firing lanes. Over time, the forest began to consume the very advantage that made them deadly. Still, they waited, because waiting was all they knew. When the U.S. 28th and 8th Infantry Divisions entered the Hürtgen, they expected another offensive like Normandy or the Siegfried Line. They brought firepower, logistics, and confidence. None of that mattered here. In the forest, artillery was unpredictable. Radio communication failed under the thick canopy. Visibility shrank to mere meters, and patrols disappeared without a trace. Standard tactics, flanking, suppressing, advancing, collapsed in the mud and trees. the infantrymen were forced to evolve. They began to study the forest the way the Germans did. Small unit tactics replaced broad maneuvers. Squads moved in pairs or threes, whispering signals instead of shouting. When a sniper fired, they didn't scatter in panic. They froze, waited, and used artillery smoke to conceal counter-movements. One veteran of the 12th Infantry Regiment later described it bluntly. "You learned not to fight the forest. You moved with it." The Americans adapted their weaponry too. The M1 Garand, semi-automatic and reliable in mud, gave them faster response than the bolt-action rifles of the Germans. Scouts carried Thompson submachine guns or bars for close-quarters bursts. Engineers followed behind with flamethrowers and demolitions, burning out bunkers that could not be taken by rifle fire alone. Their tactics became a rhythm. Artillery, smoke, advance, pause, repeat. The gray curtain of smoke was no longer a signal of confusion. It was a tool of survival. Through this adaptation, the U.S. infantry began to turn the forest's own hostility into cover. They didn't need to see. They only needed to move. The Germans, trained to rely on vision, were left peering into blindness. It wasn't speed or technology that changed the battle. It was the hard lesson of fear learned through repetition. The men who had once been hunted were now learning to hunt in return. The Hurtgen was unlike any other battlefield of the war. It was not a plain or a city, not a desert or beach. It was a labyrinth built by nature and destroyed by man. Everywhere, the forest fought back. Shellfire ripped through trees, sending shards of wood spinning faster than bullets. Mud swallowed boots and bodies alike. The constant drizzle turned uniforms into soaked rags and froze hands around rifle stocks. For both sides, the terrain created a kind of madness. Maps were useless. Units became lost within minutes of entering. Men sometimes advanced in circles, stumbling into their own lines. The air itself seemed alive, filled with echoes, breaking branches, and the constant whisper of unseen movement. To the Germans, the forest was ally and armor. It hid their defenses, their trenches, their snipers. To the Americans, it was a wall, one that seemed to regenerate after every bombardment. Psychologists later studied the Hurtgen campaign and found a pattern. Prolonged exposure to such an environment produced what soldiers called forest shock. It was a unique blend of fatigue, paranoia, and silence-induced fear. Men would stop responding, stare blankly into the mist, unable to distinguish enemy from shadow. The Germans used that silence deliberately. They allowed the Americans to walk deep into their kill zones before firing. One rifle shot, then nothing. The pause was more frightening than the sound. Yet by November, the forest began to betray its defenders. Continuous shelling had stripped much of the canopy. Smoke from constant artillery mixed with fog to form a permanent haze. Visibility dropped so low that even the most experienced snipers struggled to tell where the next threat came from. The same fog that once shielded German movements was now being manufactured by American artillery to cover their own. The forest, once a fortress, had turned neutral, an equal killer of both sides. In that thick gray world, vision ceased to matter. Only movement did. And in the coming days, that truth would change the battle entirely. As German marksmen, blinded by their own terrain, found themselves facing soldiers who seemed to walk through smoke like phantoms from another world. The balance between fear and control was about to collapse. The next shift would come from technology, leadership, and the raw human endurance that defined the Hurtgen's final acts. By November 1944, the Americans had learned that victory in the Hurtgen would not come from visibility, but from the lack of it. Their most valuable weapon was not a rifle, nor a tank, nor even artillery. It was smoke. Originally designed to obscure movement or signal coordinates, Smoke shells and smoke grenades became tactical equalizers. Fired in precise sequences by forward observers, they could create an artificial fog thicker than the natural mist of the forest. The Germans had never faced an enemy that used the environment against them so completely. When the first gray curtains rolled through the pines, German snipers assumed it was a temporary cover, a brief concealment for engineers or wounded evacuation. But then, shapes began to emerge through it, squads of U.S. infantry moving silently, rifles ready, not waiting for the smoke to lift. This was new. To the defenders, it was terrifying. The human mind is trained to locate threats by sight. But in the Hurtgen, smoke blinded both sides. Only the Americans had adapted their movements to it. They counted paces, followed whispered signals, and memorized the terrain. The smoke was chaos for one side, precision for the other. At close range, the smoke dissolved into sudden violence. Germans would hear boots crunching, the click of metal, then muzzle flashes only feet away. The Americans advanced as coordinated phantoms, using technology not to destroy, but to disappear. Engineers and artillery officers refined the technique day by day. Some battalions used phosphorus smoke, which clung to the ground longer and obscured even the brightest daylight. Others synchronized barrages with infantry timing so perfectly that advancing troops emerged from haze at the exact moment the German rifles stopped firing. The effect was psychological as much as tactical. To many German defenders, it felt as if the Americans were no longer human, emerging from smoke, striking with precision, then vanishing back into the gray. It was not superstition. It was adaptation under fire. For the first time, invisibility belonged to the attacker. Every advance in the Hurtgen came at a human price, far beyond the imagination of those who planned it. The soldiers on both sides were trapped in a purgatory of noise, exhaustion, and fear. American divisions lost men by the hundreds every week, not just to bullets, but to weather, disease, and despair. Pneumonia and trench foot spread faster than reinforcements could arrive. Many soldiers could not recall how long they had been in the forest. Time itself dissolved into gray days and sleepless nights. For the Germans, conditions were no better. Their food rations dwindled to cold tins and black bread. Medical supplies were scarce, and field hospitals were often shelled or abandoned. Wounded men froze where they fell. The once proud discipline of the Wehrmacht gave way to quiet resignation. One paratrooper of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division later described it in a single sentence: "You did not fear death anymore. Only the forest." The silence was often worse than battle. Between bombardments, men sat in holes too afraid to move, too numb to speak. The fog isolated them from reality. Even the sound of their own voices felt wrong. The line between soldier and shadow blurred. When units finally made contact, the fighting was sudden, close, and merciless. The forest offered no room for retreat. Soldiers stumbled upon enemies at point-blank range, both startled, both firing instantly. There was no front, no rear, only confusion. In the aftermath of each skirmish, the wounded called out, but medics often could not reach them for hours. Some were never reached at all. The smoke that had shielded the living also hid the dying. After weeks of such fighting, reports of combat exhaustion skyrocketed. Soldiers described seeing movements that weren't there, or hearing whispers in the fog. For many, the boundary between life and death had become intangible, as if the forest itself kept its own tally of the souls it took. Still, orders were obeyed. The forest would be cleared, no matter the cost. Behind the front line, strategy often collided with reality. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, was under pressure from above. General Omar Bradley wanted the advance to continue, to secure the Ruhr River dams before winter. Hodges followed those orders relentlessly, believing each fresh attack would finally break the German line. But the forest was not breaking. It was consuming. Division commanders on the ground, such as Major General Norman Cota of the 28th Division, protested the senseless attrition. Cota, a D-Day hero, saw his regiments shredded in weeks. He famously told his staff, "You can't fight a forest." But his protests were buried in higher priority orders. The German side faced similar disconnection. Field commanders, including General Erich Straube, begged for withdrawal to better terrain. But the OKW, Hitler's military headquarters, forbade it. Orders came directly from Berlin. Hold the Hurtgen. Deny the Americans the dams. No retreat. Thus, both armies were bound by command decisions that ignored the ground truth. The men inside the forest, the ones crawling through mud and smoke, were fighting wars dictated by maps and deadlines, not by survival. Leadership in the Hurtgen became less about strategy and more about endurance. Junior officers often acted independently, making tactical calls based purely on instinct. Company commanders rotated hourly. Platoon leaders were promoted on the spot after predecessors fell. Communication failures forced improvisation. Artillery strikes sometimes landed on friendly positions. Entire battalions lost direction, advancing toward invisible objectives. The forest absorbed every mistake. And yet, through this chaos, a kind of grim leadership emerged, not from rank, but from will. Sergeants, medics, and even privates held their lines not for victory, but for the men beside them. In the absence of clarity, loyalty became command. By late November, both high command structures, American and German, were reaching breaking point. Orders were still being given, but few believed in them. The forest had become its own authority. Soon, that authority would deliver its verdict. In a single confrontation that turned confidence into confusion and waiting into terror. The stage was set. German snipers crouched once more in their positions, waiting confidently in the gray dawn. But this time, what emerged from the smoke would defy everything they believed about control, range, and dominance. The morning broke in silence. A cold mist crawled through the pines, heavy with the residue of artillery. The ground was slick with ash and rain. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, German snipers from the 275th Infantry Division scanned through their scopes, waiting for movement that would never come. They had held these positions for weeks, firing, shifting, waiting again. Their camouflage was flawless, their confidence absolute. The forest was theirs. At 0630 hours, a distant thud echoed across the valley. One, then another, then dozens. The Germans recognized the sound. Artillery. But something was different. These weren't explosive shells. They hissed, not roared. Within minutes, the air turned opaque. Thick gray clouds spreading like ink through the trees. It was smoke. At first, the snipers waited for it to lift. Standard American tactics used smoke briefly, a minute, maybe two, to mask an approach. Then it would clear, and visibility would return. But this time, the smoke didn't fade. It grew. The forest was swallowed. Through the haze, the snipers could hear faint sounds. Boots crunching, gear clinking, branches snapping under weight. Their scopes showed nothing but white. Some fired blind, guessing at shapes that weren't there. Others held fire, saving ammunition. Minutes passed. The sounds grew closer. Still no targets. Then, a voice, sharp and muffled. "Move!" Figures appeared in the fog, not in a line, not rushing, walking, slow, silent, methodical. Helmets low, rifles steady. The smoke rolled around them like a tide, distorting every edge of motion. A sniper near the ridge exhaled, centered his crosshairs on a shifting outline, and squeezed. The rifle cracked. When the smoke cleared momentarily, no body lay where he aimed, just mist and drifting leaves. Then came the counterfire. Short bursts from M1 Garands and bars, precise and brief. The German sniper slumped before realizing he'd been spotted. His partner crawled for cover, eyes burning from the phosphorus that hung in the air. The Americans were no longer charging through open ground. They were inside the smoke, coordinated, ghost-like, advancing in disciplined silence. Each squad had memorized its path from the map and rehearsed distances in steps. One man carried a compass, another the timing. They moved in rhythm with artillery support, every volley of smoke guiding their next push. German command tried to call for artillery correction, but their observers couldn't see. Radios crackled uselessly. The smoke smothered sight lines. Every known coordinate had vanished in the fog. Panic began to creep in. From the southern sector near Wassenach, the 8th Infantry Division made a breakthrough. The forest floor trembled as engineers cleared mines under cover of haze. Behind them, riflemen advanced one tree at a time, scanning through the milky gray for any flash of muzzle fire. At Ariete 15, they reached the first German bunker. The defenders fired wild bursts through the smoke. The Americans circled around, tossing grenades through the back entrance. The explosion echoed like thunder in the fog. One sergeant, his face streaked with soot, recalled years later. "We couldn't see them. They couldn't see us. It was just shadows killing shadows." The snipers tried to reposition, but the forest betrayed them. The same concealment that once made them invisible now blinded them completely. Some attempted to climb for higher vantage points, but the shattered trees offered no safety. Every motion drew a bullet. Within hours, entire German sniper teams were silenced, not by superior marksmanship, but by suffocation of visibility. Their rifles became useless sticks in a world without distance. To many survivors, the moment felt unreal. The Americans didn't seem to fight like men anymore. They appeared and vanished, their outlines barely forming before dissolving back into haze. And as the smoke deepened, sound itself warped, muffled, close, and directionless. The Germans could no longer tell where the front was. A machine gun might be 50 meters away or 5. Voices echoed from nowhere. By mid-morning, the 275th Division's forward line had collapsed into confusion. Orders failed to reach the snipers on the flanks. Those still alive fired at random, retreating blindly through trees that all looked the same. Above them, the canopy glowed faintly from white phosphorus drifting through the branches. The forest looked like it was burning, but the flames never came, only the smoke. Endless and cold, inside that gray inferno, the hunters had lost their sight, and the hunted had become ghosts. The smoke that morning was more than a tactic. It was a shift in the nature of the fight. For the first time, control in the Hurtgen forest belonged not to those who could see, but to those who could move without seeing. And as the day deepened, this eerie transformation would erupt into full chaos, where visibility, command, and sanity all dissolved in the fog. The smoke did not clear that afternoon. It thickened. By midday on 21st November 1944, the Hurtgen forest had become a shifting labyrinth of fog, fire, and shattered command. What began as a tactical maneuver had grown into something elemental. The very air had turned against the defenders. German snipers, once calm and methodical, were now fighting blind, their scopes fogged, their landmarks erased. The wind pushed the smoke through every hollow, choking trenches and filling bunkers. The crisp, clinical precision of the snipers' war had disintegrated into panic and guesswork. For the U.S. 8th Infantry Division, this was the moment they had trained for. A silent push through blindness. Squads advanced by instinct. The leading man touched the shoulder of the one ahead. The line moved like a single organism through the gray. When muzzle flashes appeared, they reacted instantly. A burst from a bar. A grenade lobbed toward sound rather than sight. Every few meters, a body would appear from the smoke. Friend or foe uncertain until the shape fell. In one sector, Company K of the 121st Infantry Regiment crept along a ravine where German machine guns had dominated for days. The positions were invisible now, lost in haze. The Americans advanced beneath the cloud, guided only by memory and rhythm. When they reached the base of the ridge, they split silently, one group climbing the slope, the other circling wide. A single grenade rolled into a bunker entrance. The explosion cracked the quiet like lightning, followed by screams, then silence again. The forest swallowed the sound as quickly as it was born. Moments later, a flare burst overhead. White light cutting through gray for just a heartbeat. In that flash, the Americans saw what days of combat had hidden. Rows of shattered trees, bodies half buried in mud, rifles jutting from the earth like markers in an unending grave. Then the light vanished. Smoke returned. For the German defenders, the battle was dissolving into chaos. Communications had collapsed completely. Field telephones were dead. Runners never returned. Each squad fought alone, unaware that neighboring units had already been overrun or withdrawn. From the bunker complex east of Hurtgen village, Saumataden or Tidremen a sniper team under Lieutenant Karl Reiner held position until ammunition ran out. They tried to relocate, but the smoke disoriented them. They walked in circles for nearly an hour before realizing they were retracing their own tracks. When American voices broke the silence nearby, Reiner gave the order to hide, not fight. His last diary entry, later recovered, ended with 5 words: "The fog is full of men." By late afternoon, the balance of the forest had shifted completely. The 275th Infantry Division, once confident in its hold on the ridges, was falling back under pressure it couldn't see. American patrols began cutting through communication lines, seizing small clearings, and turning German trenches against their owners. One artillery observer from the U.S. 12th Infantry Regiment described the moment in his report, "You couldn't tell who fired first." The forest sounded alive. Every tree had a voice, every echo a threat. The smoke barrage continued without pause. Even the Germans' own artillery became useless. Their fire missions canceled for fear of hitting friendly positions. The same precision that once defined the Wehrmacht's defense was gone, replaced by instinct and confusion. Then came the close fighting. As the Americans closed in, combat turned primitive. Knives, shovels, even entrenching tools became weapons. Visibility was measured in meters. Hesitation meant death. The forest floor was slick with rain and blood. Men stumbled through fallen trunks, striking at shadows. There was no direction anymore, only survival. By evening, the sound of organized gunfire had faded. The smoke had done its work. The German snipers, the sharpest eyes of the battlefield, were gone. Some killed, some captured. Others vanished into the gray they once commanded. When night fell, the haze began to thin. American soldiers emerged from the fog one by one, faces blackened with soot, helmets dented, eyes wide and hollow. They looked like the ghosts the Germans had imagined. They didn't cheer. There was no triumph, only exhaustion. The forest was silent again. Too silent. In the dim light of dusk, medics moved among the bodies. German and American dead lay together, indistinguishable under the gray film that covered everything. The smoke that had hidden the living now cloaked the dead. A corporal from the 8th Division later wrote in his diary, "When it cleared, it was like waking from a nightmare. Except the nightmare stayed." That day, the Hurtgen took hundreds more lives, but it also broke the myth of German invincibility within its trees. The snipers, once the forest's silent rulers, had been undone not by marksmanship or numbers, but by the loss of the one thing they trusted most: sight. And in their place, the Americans moved on, not as victors but as survivors, pushing deeper into a forest that no longer belonged to anyone. The battle's outcome marked a grim turning point. The forest, though technically taken, had drained both armies beyond recovery. Yet the war itself pressed onward, toward even greater trials waiting just beyond the trees. When the smoke finally lifted over the Hurtgen forest, it revealed not victory, but ruin. The battle that began as a push toward the Roer River had become one of the most costly operations in the Western Front's campaign. Between November 16th and November 29th, 1944, American divisions had clawed through barely 5 miles of forest. The German defenders, mostly remnants of the 275th and 344th Infantry Divisions, bolstered by local Volksgrenadier units, had fought with a desperation born of exhaustion. Neither side truly controlled the woods. They simply bled in them. The U.S. 8th Infantry Division reported over 4,500 casualties in 2 weeks. The 9th and 28th Divisions, still reeling from earlier phases, lost thousands more. Many weren't killed by bullets, but by exposure, shock, or infection. The forest devoured men as effectively as enemy fire. For the Germans, losses were equally devastating, though impossible to measure precisely. By late November, the 275th Division had ceased to exist as a coherent fighting unit. Sniper teams, once confident in their dominance, were wiped out or captured. Their tactics, built on visibility and distance, meant nothing in a world of smoke and blind contact. In captured German diaries and reports, Allied intelligence found a recurring theme: disbelief. Many soldiers wrote that the Americans had used some new fog weapon, a psychological terror as much as a tactical one. The phrase "ghost soldiers" appeared repeatedly in accounts from survivors who described firing at figures that dissolved before impact. But there was nothing supernatural about what happened in Hurtgen. It was the culmination of evolving battlefield science. The use of smoke shells and white phosphorus not just as cover, but as an environmental weapon. The Americans had turned terrain and chemistry into allies. Yet even in success, the cost was unbearable. Every meter of ground was bought with lives. The fog that had blinded the Germans had also disoriented American units. Some squads vanished into the haze and were never found. Friendly fire incidents surged. Soldiers spoke of hearing screams and being unable to tell which side they came from. One after-action report from the 8th Infantry Division summarized the victory bluntly. Objective secured. Visibility nil. Morale exhausted. The Hurtgen campaign achieved its limited goals, securing the approaches to the Roer dams and denying the Germans staging ground. But the psychological toll was far greater. Veterans of the forest carried its silence with them long after the war. When reporters later asked survivors what they remembered most, they didn't mention courage or victory. They mentioned the smoke, that endless gray that stripped away direction, sound, and reason. For the Germans, the defeat marked the end of their illusion of control in the West. Their snipers, once the pride of their infantry, had been humbled by an enemy who no longer played by the visible rules of war. The idea that training and terrain could guarantee dominance vanished in that fog. For the Americans, the victory felt hollow. They had proven adaptability, mastering movement without sight, discipline under disorientation. But they had also learned that some triumphs leave nothing intact. In letters home, soldiers compared the forest to a living thing, one that consumed men and machines alike. "It's not a place," wrote a private from the 12th Infantry Regiment. "It's a memory that won't let go." As engineers cleared the battlefield days later, they found rifles still in the hands of the dead, both American and German, frozen in positions of aim, as if the fighting had never ended. And beneath the heavy silence, the forest itself seemed to keep breathing, wounded, but still alive. But the story of the Hurtgen's aftermath didn't end with silence. Beyond the smoke and destruction lay strategic consequences, decisions that shaped the next and final German gamble of the war. In the weeks after the fighting ceased, the Hurtgen Forest stood as a monument to futility. The U.S. Army, though technically victorious, gained only a narrow stretch of ravaged woodland, a region so shattered it no longer held tactical value. What it cost to take it was far greater than what was achieved. When the Americans finally reached the Roer River dams, they found them heavily damaged and rigged for demolition. German engineers had already prepared to flood the valley below should the Allies advance. The months-long fight through Hurtgen had given the Wehrmacht precious time to fortify the next line, time they would soon use for something far larger. By early December 1944, as exhausted American units pulled out of the forest to rest and refit, German intelligence noted their depleted strength and faltering morale. The Germans saw opportunity. Behind the Siegfried Line, Hitler was already preparing his last counterstrike. Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Ironically, the same smoke and fog that had blinded snipers in Hurtgen would soon return, this time as natural weather, to shield entire armored divisions moving west through the Ardennes. Hurtgen had been a warning the Allies didn't fully heed. Commanders had underestimated both terrain and weather, overestimated the effectiveness of brute force, and learned too late that visibility, not numbers, often decided battles. For the 1st U.S. Army, the aftermath forced painful lessons. Reports from division and corps level admitted to operational errors. Attacking through terrain unsuited for mechanized warfare, neglecting to rotate exhausted units, and underestimating German resilience even in collapse. Major General James Collins, writing after the war, summarized the campaign in one sentence: Hurtgen was where the forest fought back. In Germany, the propaganda machine tried to transform defeat into defiance. Newspapers in Cologne and Aachen described the Hurtgen as proof of unbroken German spirit, claiming their troops had bled the Americans white. In part, it was true. U.S. forces had suffered roughly 33,000 casualties in total across the full campaign, a staggering number for such limited ground. Yet behind the headlines, the Wehrmacht's officer corps knew the truth. The forest had destroyed their best remaining defensive units. The 275th Division, already mauled on the Eastern Front, was now gone. The German army had defended well, but it could not replace what it had lost. The Hurtgen was a Pyrrhic delay, not salvation. For the soldiers who survived, the memories clung like the smoke itself. Veterans spoke of how, even weeks later, the scent of phosphorus would rise from their uniforms when they unpacked gear. Some men refused to enter wooded areas again. Others said the fog haunted their dreams, that even in daylight, they sometimes caught themselves staring into nothing, waiting for shapes to appear. The U.S. Army's Medical Corps recorded unprecedented cases of combat exhaustion, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. The forest's silence, its claustrophobia, its endless gray had worn away more than bodies. It had eroded minds. Years after the war, one former sniper from the German side, Heinrich Krüger, was interviewed by a British journalist. His words captured the inversion perfectly. In Russia, we hunted. In Hurtgen, we were hunted. The smoke never ended. It was not war anymore. It was blindness. The Americans, too, remembered. The lessons learned there directly shaped the tactics of urban combat in the Ruhr and the crossing of the Rhine, emphasizing movement, coordination, and the use of smoke and cover not as an afterthought, but as a weapon. Yet the greatest lesson was not tactical. It was human. The battle showed that even the most advanced armies could lose themselves when stripped of sight and sound, when war reduced men to instincts alone. As the snow began to fall over Western Germany in December 1944, the last echoes of gunfire in Hurtgen faded into the distance. The forest, blanketed in white, hid the scars of the past weeks. Beneath that quiet surface, hundreds of soldiers still lay buried, unseen, unknown, consumed by the place where the fog had turned soldiers into ghosts. The world moved on toward the Ardennes, toward the final collapse of the Reich, but Hurtgen remained, silent, gray, and watchful. What the soldiers carried from that forest would follow them to war's end, and long beyond. The story now turns from consequence to meaning. What the Hurtgen truly revealed about modern warfare, fear, and the limits of human endurance. The Battle of Hurtgen Forest was never meant to be remembered. It was not decisive, not glorious, not even strategically clear, yet it became one of the most haunting symbols of the Second World War. Not for what it achieved, but for what it revealed. In those gray woods between Aachen and the Ruhr, two industrial powers collided not in open fields or city ruins, but in a maze of silence. Technology met terrain, and terrain won. The smoke that once gave the Americans cover and turned the Germans blind was more than a weapon. It was a mirror. It showed both sides the limits of control. For the Germans, Hurtgen marked the moment when mastery of marksmanship and precision gave way to helplessness. When men trained to dominate the battlefield were reduced to guessing shapes in a fog. For the Americans, it was proof that courage alone was not enough. Survival demanded adaptation, discipline, and a willingness to fight unseen. The forest became an equalizer, stripping away rank, pride, and doctrine. In that blindness, generals and privates shared the same fear: the loss of direction, of meaning, of self. Long after the war, veterans would speak of it quietly, if at all. They would describe not the fighting, but the atmosphere, the way the forest absorbed sound, the way the smoke seemed alive, the way time stopped inside it. There was no heroism in those memories, only endurance. Today, Hurtgen remains, its trees grown back, its bunkers hidden beneath moss. Hikers walk the same trails once soaked in blood, unaware that beneath their feet lie fragments of helmets, buttons, and unmarked graves. The forest keeps its secrets well, yet the story endures, whispered in documentaries and war journals, because it speaks of something deeper than tactics or victory. It reminds us that war is not only fought between armies, but between humanity and its own inventions, between sight and blindness, noise and silence, life and its sudden erasure. In the end, the sniper's confidence, the American's ghosts, and the endless gray of the Hurtgen all converge into one truth. No matter how advanced warfare becomes, the battlefield always belongs to chaos, and sometimes chaos wears the face of a quiet forest shrouded in smoke.